I'd always drawn. I've always loved drawing. I always loved drawing cartoons. I always drew to make people laugh, and then I kind of spent my childhood drawing my parents and my teachers.
Yeah.
And it was definitely that thing of being critical of authority figures, but not really with any specific political bent. I didn't have any philosophies, really. I wasn't a very political person, not from a very political family. It was just a very broad thing about this is a great way of puncturing the egos of people who give us rules,
Yeah. Did you always feel like a rebel? Were you sort of sensitive to the hypocrisy of the adult world?
I was, yeah. I was always aware of authority that was clearly just for authority's sake, rules that didn't really make sense. And I was always aware, I always found it fascinating once you start drawing cartoons of people, the different ways they're received. Some people absolutely love it and they can see themselves straight away.
Yeah.
And other people really don't like it. Because it's not how they see themselves, or it's not how they try to be seen.
Yeah.
So I always really enjoyed that.
Did you enjoy seeing people squirm? Was there a bit of a power?
Well, it was funny because obviously when I was at school and I used to draw teachers or sometimes other pupils, often the plan would not be that they would end up seeing it. It would be for the entertainment of my peers, and it was how I made a lot of friends. But inevitably, someone grabs it and passes it to the front of the class.
Yeah.
So the teacher sees it, and then that's when you'd get the different reactions where they either stick it up on the board or you get a detention.
Yeah.
And then obviously when I was about 14, I started to hear about this job that you can do where you do cartoons for a newspaper, drawing politicians. And I thought, well, that sounds like exactly what I'm supposed to do. It's obviously a very niche thing that there's no set path to get into. So I went and did an illustration degree, and I found the one course where they would let you do political stuff. And I just, I think while I was at university, I got to know a lot of the other cartoonists who were already working, Guardian and Times and Telegraph. I'd come up to London with my portfolio and find them in a pub or at an awards thing. And
was that off your own bat?
Yeah, and I entered while I was still at uni. I think yes, because I understood how unlikely it was to actually get a job, because there aren't many people with the weird skill set to do it. There aren't that many jobs that exist for a major paper. It's like there's probably 15 people in the country at any one time who do it regularly. So, and also once people have a job like that, they tend to stay until they're in their mid-80s.
Yeah.
And either die at their desk or eventually get booted out.
Yeah.
So I sort of spent, after I graduated, I spent 3 or 4 years working in pubs and hotels, and I spent all my spare time drawing cartoons and just sending them to editors, magazines and newspapers. And I rarely got any response. And eventually this job came up at the Telegraph, and one of the other cartoonists had put in a word for me, saying, "Oh, you should give this guy a try." And I got called in, and that was in 2011. And I sort of started out just doing a couple a week, or it might have even been a couple every fortnight for them. And I stayed there for 10 years, and I kind of worked my way up to being their main political cartoonist. Built up a really good rapport with the readership, and I was sort of winning awards, and it was all great. So I was very happy, and obviously I'd accomplished everything I had ever wanted, really. I went at the Telegraph, and eventually they gave me an employment contract, so I had a proper salary and paid holiday and all these things that someone like me nowadays would never really get. You shouldn't, it's pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
And I'm totally immersed in the mainstream media machine. And I was obviously aware from early on about the fact that it's not entirely the way the public perceive it, as in, what you read in a newspaper is not whatever the journalists know is happening in the world and they feel the public needs to know.
Yeah.
There's loads of kind of processes of filtration and things they hold back or things they deliberately don't put in the paper because journalists have relationships with, politicians. Maybe they went to school with them, or perhaps they're just having lunch with them next week, or maybe they want the politician to write a piece for the paper so they're not going to criticise what they're doing this week. There's all kinds of things like that. And you just sort of accept it and you think, well, I suppose that makes sense. And I guess I believed that stuff happened within certain boundaries. So up to a point, there's this kind of slight deception, but I believed it wouldn't be allowed to go too far.
Right. Was the part of you that felt uncomfortable? Did you just almost not listen to that voice?
I think when I started, I was only 25. I was pretty naive, and I had so much to learn about how a paper worked, and about I wasn't really ready when I started. I basically had to spend the first couple of years learning on the job.
Yeah.
It's not something you can prepare for, in that you can't really simulate being in a paper with a deadline, having all these different news stories, working with different editors. You've got to just go in and do it. So this idea of what is this machine I'm in, how much does the truth matter?
Yeah.
Do I agree with this story? That didn't bother me as much to begin with, because I'm just thinking, how do I do this in 6 hours?
Right, okay.
What do I want to make it look like? How do I cope with, a lot of the time, you might get an idea approved and you'll be halfway through, and then a news story will break and someone will come and say, right, put that in the bin, start again.
Yeah.
You've got 2 hours to do something new. You have to experience all of that, and that's pretty much all you're focused on. And my style completely shifted in those first few years from when I started to what I'm doing now is kind of similar to probably what I was doing from about 4 years into working at the Telegraph. But all that stuff I should have done at university when I was sort of busy having fun.
Yeah.
What paper am I using? What paints?
All
practical
skills,
practical stuff. I didn't really learn until I was actually working at the paper.
Yeah, well, we can get onto the education system and the agenda behind that. Yeah.
So it wasn't really, I suppose, until 2020 when all the madness started to happen with the announcement of the lockdowns and this idea we were in a pandemic, I began to feel really uncomfortable. Not with my position at the paper necessarily, but just it felt very different to everything I'd covered before in terms of how journalists were responding and how the politicians were responding.
Right.
And it felt like that idea I'd had of, well, these people have never let it get too far. If the idea I had was, well, if the politicians ever went really rogue and started imposing tyranny and actually harming people, these journalists are going to hold them to account.
Yeah.
And they just weren't.
Yeah.